So let's quickly go over the bones that make up the pelvic girdle and the lower extremity. So let's start over. So as you're preparing to study the pelvic girdle and the lower extremity, then you need to get all of these bones out of your box so that you have all the bones organized. So quickly going over the bones, this large bone is called the os cox. This bone is a bone that we've covered in the past, which is the sacrum. And they make up the pelvic girdle, where we'd have two of these, a left and right, and one of these. And then what attaches to the os cox is the femur. So this large bone is the femur, the largest bone in our body. As we move to the lower leg, then the large bone in the lower leg is the tibia. The narrow bone in the lower leg is the fibula. And then as we move to our foot, just like in our hand, these bones that form our ankle are called tarsal bones. The bones that form the long part of the foot are called metatarsals. And the bones that form the toes are called phalanxes or phalanges again. So what we can see here is a articulated pelvic girdle. So you can see that posteriorly we have the sacrum that forms the posterior surface of it. On this side we have an os cox, and then on this side we have an os cox. And then midline we have fibrocartilage that's gone right here, which would create the pubic symphysis that creates this entire pelvis that we're looking at. So if we take one of the os coxes off, then we have a bone that looks like this. So we can actually manipulate it, turn it around. So if we use this deep depression here where the head of the femur sets, then if we cover up the bottom part of that, then all of the bone we're seeing above my hand is called the ilium. When we take this depression again and cover it like this, then the bone we're seeing below my hand is the ischium. And then if we manipulate the hand again so that we're covering everything, from that, then the bone we're seeing here is the pubic bone. So embryologically, this bone forms from three centers of ossification that form the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So when we're looking at the ilium, one of the things that you can palpate on yourself is this long, high ridge on the ilium, which is the ridge we're seeing here, which is the iliac crest. As we come anterior to that, we have a projection anterior, and then we have a secondary projection right here. So relating what we were just looking at here together, then we follow the iliac crest forward. We have an anterior projection here, which is called the anterior superior iliac spine. As we drop below that, we have this secondary projection here, which is the anterior inferior iliac spine. So if we follow the crest backwards, so that we're following the crest backwards, and so as we turn this one to where the os cox articulates with the sacrum, then if we follow the crest around, we have a projection here, and we have a projection here. So this would be the posterior superior iliac spine, and this would be the posterior inferior iliac spine. So now if we do that again with this bone, we go from the anterior superior iliac spine going all the way around, and we end up with this projection, which is the posterior superior iliac spine. Then we go down here to a secondary projection, which is the posterior inferior iliac spine. So what's interesting, if you look at male and female pelvises, is these spines are at different angles. So in women, we get a little dimple here and a dimple here we can see on the surface that are created by the prominence of this posterior superior iliac spine. Now, if you look at the posterior inferior iliac spine, there's a large notch that occurs below it. We can see it on the pelvis as it's articulated, and then we can see it on this bone right here. So this is called the greater sciatic notch, and the greater sciatic notch gets its name because the sciatic nerve passes through it. Now, if we look at the internal aspect of the ilium, then what we'll notice is that there's a depression here that helps support your organs. So this depression we're seeing here is called the iliac fossa. So to find that on a disarticulated bone, you have to be able to put the bone in position like it would be in your pelvis, so that would sit like that. And then here's this depression we were seeing, the iliac fossa. Here's the surface, the auricular surface, that would articulate with the sacrum itself. Now as we move to a lower component, then the most obvious thing on the os cox is this very deep depression in which the head of the femur sits. So this depression is called the acetabulum. If you look that up in Latin, it would mean vinegar cup. So this was kind of a cup-like structure that was used. So if we go below the acetabulum, we have this really rounded process, which is what you sit on when you sit in a chair. And so it's called the ischial tuberosity. And so it's part of the ischium. So once you find the ischial tuberosity, and then you remember where the greater sciatic notch is, then there's a projection between the two, which is the ischial spine. And once you find the ischial spine, there's a smaller depression under it, which is the lesser sciatic notch. So you can see the greater sciatic notch and the lesser sciatic notch as we're looking at that. Now, if we look at an articulated bone, then again, here would be our greater sciatic notch, here would be our ischial spine, here would be our lesser sciatic notch, and then here's that ischial tuberosity that we were talking about. Now as we look at the front aspect of the bone, then this is the pubic bone. And so what would connect them in the middle here would be the pubic symphysis. So the top of this bone is called the pubic crest. So when you look at this bone, this is actually a bone with two angles and projections of bone off those angles. So if you'll recall, when we did general structures of bones, that a bone projection off an angle is called a ramus. So this projection is the superior pubic ramus, and this projection is the inferior pubic ramus. Now, as we look at a articulated pelvis, there are things about a pelvis that help us distinguish whether it's a male or female pelvis. And so, for example, in x-rays, you can check to make sure that the x-ray was appropriately labeled for a male or a female. So there's several things we can look at. So one of the obvious is when we put the two pubic bones together and we look at the angles of the pubic ramus. This is a male that has a very, very sharp angle. If I had a female pelvis here, this angle would be really broad. And what it does is it widens the pelvic outlet for baby's head to come through. And we'll look at those in lab. The other thing we could look at is the false pelvis, which is the distance across the iliac crest. Men tend to be more vertical there. Women tend to be more horizontal to provide a platform for carrying the baby. The pelvic brim or inlet is this ridge of bone that we look down into the pelvis with. A baby's head is real oval, so a woman's would be very oval, and this one you can clearly see is heart-shaped. So again, a good example of what a male pelvis would demonstrate. Then if we turn it over, then the distance between the ischial tuberosities is called the pelvic outlet, and in men it's narrow, in women it's wider. And then if we looked at the ischial spines, men's point slightly more medial, women's are much more posterior pointing. So those are all the kind of things that we could look at to determine whether a pelvis is a male or female pelvis. And we'll look at examples of that in lab.